Story 1. The Man in the Rearview. Submitted by Lucy. This happened to me a couple years ago, and I still get chills just thinking about it. I was 23 at the time, fresh out of college, and working my first job in a city about 2 hours away from my hometown. I'd make the drive back home every other weekend to see my family and friends. One Friday afternoon, after a particularly long week, I decided to head home. I started my drive around 3 p.m., thinking I'd beat the evening rush hour. I've always loved afternoon drives. There's something calming about the open roads and the hum of the car. But that day was different. About an hour into my drive, I noticed a car behind me. It wasn't too close, but it was the only other car I could see on the road. I didn't think much of it at first, but after a few minutes, I realized this car was mirroring my every move. If I changed lanes, it changed lanes. If I sped up, it sped up. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe they were just heading in the same direction. But then, things got weirder. I decided to take an exit that I normally wouldn't, just to see if the car would follow. And of course, it did. At this point, I was getting scared. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I took a few random turns trying to lose the car, but it stayed right behind me. I remembered reading somewhere that if you think you're being followed, you should drive to a police station. In my panic, I couldn't remember where the nearest one was. So, I did the next best thing. I pulled into the busiest gas station I could find. I thought the car would just drive past, but it didn't. It pulled in right behind me. I locked my doors and grabbed my phone, ready to dial 911. But then, the driver of the other car got out. It was a man, probably in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked up to my window and knocked. I was frozen in fear, but I managed to crack the window just a bit. "Are you okay? Where is he?" he asked, his eyes darting around. Confused, I replied, "Who?" "I saw someone sitting beside you earlier. He never took his eyes off you. He looked mad. I saw him turn and look at me." That was impossible. I had been driving alone. There was no one with me. Then the realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. I thanked the man, my voice shaky, and he quickly got back in his car and drove off. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what had just happened. Had there really been someone in my car? And if so, where were they now? To this day, I don't know if that man saw a ghost, a figment of his imagination, or something else entirely. But one thing's for sure, I always check the back seat before I start the car. Story 2. The Empty Seat. Submitted by Sabbatha. I was a bus driver for a small town. Not the most glamorous job, I know, but it paid the bills. I was one of the few female drivers, and being in my early 20s, I was also one of the youngest. Most of my routes were during the day, but occasionally, I'd get the late night shifts. Those were always a bit eerie because the roads were mostly empty and the dim streetlights barely lit up the surroundings. One particular night, I was driving the last route of the day. It was around midnight, and the bus was empty. I mean, it was a Tuesday night in a small town, so who would be riding the bus, right? As I was driving, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. It looked like a car was following me, but thought that was unlikely. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. But after a few turns, the car was still tailing me. This is where I started to get nervous. I tried not to be paranoid, thinking maybe they were just lost or something. But the longer they followed, the more nervous I became. I decided to test it out. I took a detour from my usual route, making a couple of random turns. And the car, it stayed right behind me. At this point, my heart was pounding. I thought about calling the police, but what was I going to say? Hey, there's a car following my bus? I needed to be sure. So, I pulled into an empty parking lot, thinking they'd just drive past. But they didn't. They pulled in behind me, blocking my exit. Panic set in. I locked all the bus doors and tried to stay calm. I was about to call 911 when a woman from the car started frantically waving at me. She looked genuinely concerned, not threatening, so I cracked my window. She was shouting, "There's someone on your bus. I saw him. He seemed dangerous. I saw him hiding on the seats where you won't be able to see him, and we followed you to make sure you were okay." I was confused. "There's no one on this bus," I replied, my voice shaking. She was adamant. "I saw him. He was sitting at the back, staring right at us. We got a really bad feeling, so we decided to follow you." An icy chill ran down my back. I had checked the bus before starting my route. It was empty. I always did a thorough check because, safety first. But what if I missed someone? What if there was someone hiding? With the woman and her friend watching my back, I turned to look down the aisles, slowly. As I cautiously walked, checking each seat, my heart was in my throat. Every little sound made me jump. But there was no one. The bus was empty. Relieved, I returned to the front. The woman looked as confused as I felt. "I swear I saw someone," she said, her voice quivering. I thanked her and her friend for their concern. They left, and I finished my route, constantly checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting at the back. To this day, I don't know what really happened. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe the woman was just seeing things. Story 3: The Lost Driver by Carmela. I used to be a bus driver. Not the school kind, but the city kind. Most of my shifts were during the day, but occasionally I'd get the late night ones. Those were the worst. Not because of the drunk passengers or the rowdy teenagers, but because of one night in particular. It was a winter evening, the kind where the darkness seems to swallow the whole world by 5 p.m. I was driving the last bus of the night, which meant I'd be done by midnight. The route took me to the outskirts of the city, where the stops were fewer and the streets eerily quiet. Around 11:30 p.m., I pulled up to a dimly lit stop. There was a man standing there. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a regular-looking guy in a heavy coat and a beanie. He got on, paid his fare, and took a seat in the back. I continued on, thinking nothing of it. As I drove, I noticed in my rearview mirror that he was staring at me. Not just a casual glance, but a fixed, unblinking stare. This made me uneasy, but I tried telling myself I was just being paranoid. But every time I checked, his eyes were on me. The bus was empty except for him and me. I tried to focus on the road, but the weight of his gaze was oppressive. I decided to pull over at the next well-lit stop and take a break, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But when I stopped, he didn't move. Instead, he stood up and slowly started walking towards the front. My heart was screaming. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I had a radio and could call for help if needed. He stopped a few feet away from me and just stood there, staring. I mustered up the courage and said, "Sir, this is the end of the line. You'll need to get off." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket. My mind went wild, thinking of all the terrible things he could pull out. But it was just a photo. An old, tattered photo of a young woman. She looked eerily like me. "Do you know her?" he asked, his voice raspy and filled with emotion. I shook my head. "No, I've never seen her before." He looked at the photo, tears forming in his eyes. "She was my daughter. She used to drive this route. One night, she never came home." I remembered hearing about a young female bus driver who had gone missing a few years before I started. They never found her or the bus she was driving. He looked up at me, his gaze no longer menacing but filled with pain. "Every night, I take this bus, hoping to find some clue, some sign of her. I thought you might be her." I didn't know what to say. The weight of his grief was palpable. After a moment, he put the photo back in his pocket and left the bus. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I requested to never drive the late night route again.